returning for Xmas to find Grandpa dying while parents enjoyed a cruise. I found the proof they stole his $200,000, and now I'm stripping them of it all. I was kneeling on the frigid hardwood floor, clutching my grandfather's frozen hand, when his eyelids flickered open just long enough to breathe the words that would change everything they didn't know. Help me get revenge. For a little moment, I wasn't a Marine. I was simply a granddaughter staring at a man who had been discarded like an unwanted piece of furniture. His breath was a faint white in the cold air. The place felt like the inside of a refrigerator. And, God, that stupid note was still sitting on the counter like some cruel joke. That is when the truth began for me. But the story began several hours before. I arrived home for Christmas shortly after dusk, boots crunching on the driveway, duffel bag draped over my shoulder. I was still dressed in my Marine winter outfit, with tight collar ribbons and shoes polished enough to catch reflections. That suit had been through deployment storms, and there were times when I feared I wouldn't make it to another Christmas. But nothing prepared me for what lay within my childhood home. The first thing I noticed was how cold it was. Not just chilling, but the kind of cold that pierces through every layer you wear. I opened the door, anticipating the usual warmth, cinnamon candles, the hum of the heater, and perhaps Mom calling for me to remove my boots. My breath fogged as soon as I stepped inside. I frowned. Mom, Dad, nothing. Not even an echo. I placed my duffel on the carpet and moved deeper inside the home. The living room was dark, but for the dim glow of the streetlight outside. There was no Christmas tree, decorations, music, or anything else to imply the holiday. It felt abandoned. Then I saw it. The message was a single page of lined paper cut from a legal pad and neatly put on the counter, as if it were a caring holiday greeting. We traveled on a cruise. You take care of Grandpa. I read it again, then again, because my head couldn't take in the absurdity of what I was seeing. A cruise over Christmas, leaving Grandpa here alone. I heard the tiniest sound, a muffled groan. My training kicked in instantly. That is what the Marines teach. You do not freeze or consider. Instead, you simply move. Grandpa, I cried out as I walked down the corridor. The air became cooler as I went closer to the guest room. When I pushed the door open, the darkness felt strange, like entering a basement during a storm. I reached for the switch. The light fluctuated and then stabilized. What I witnessed made my stomach plummet. Grandpa lay in the guest bed, still wearing his cardigan and flannel pants. There were no blankets pulled up, nor was the heating turned on. His tiny hands trembled furiously, his complexion pallid and waxy, and his lips were bluish-purple. Grandpa. I hurried to his side and cupped his face. His skin felt icy. For a brief moment, memories flooded back. He taught me to fish at the old pond. He sat proudly at my boot camp graduation. He sent me handwritten letters on my first deployment. This man, who had never forgotten a birthday, had been put here to freeze as if he didn't exist. I covered him in my thick Marine winter coat, made for horrible nights in the field. His body shuddered, then relaxed into the warmth. Stay with me, I asked, my voice quivering. I'm getting help. I grabbed my phone and dialed 999. As I waited for the dispatcher, I grasped his hand and continued talking, everything instinctual and steady, the way we were taught to speak to wounded Marines. When the ambulance arrived in the driveway, red lights flashing over the snow, 2 EMTs rushed inside. One of them looked at Grandpa and whispered, Jesus, how long was he in this room? They gently lifted him onto the stretcher and covered him with heavy thermal blankets. I hopped into the back of the ambulance before anyone warned me not to. I wasn't going to leave him again. They operated on him in the hospital, surrounded by fluorescent lights and the calm beeping of machinery, warm IV fluids, oxygen-heated blankets, and cautious monitoring. The nurse explained softly. He's lucky someone found him. Another few hours. She didn't continue her sentence. I sat alongside him, grasping the chair arm so tightly that my knuckles whitened. Anger simmered beneath my skin. Not Marine discipline, not patience, but pure human wrath. My parents left him. They walked out of the house, packed their belongings, turned off the heat, and boarded a Christmas cruise like teens fleeing chores. And for what? Convenience, money, and freedom. A social worker approached me cautiously, as if sensing a storm behind my eyes. Do you know how long he was alone? I shook my head. I just got in from base. I wasn't told anything. She squeezed her lips together. This is close to elder abandonment. It's serious. I nodded, but my thoughts were 1,000 miles ahead. We are fundamentally trained to deal with threats and protect those who are unable to defend themselves. This was not a battlefield, but it certainly felt like one. Hours later, Grandpa's respiration became stable. The doctor stated he was fortunate, a touch stronger than expected for a man his age. I moved my chair closer, softly placing my arm on his, and he stirred for the first time. His eyes opened just slightly. He exhaled shakily, as if each breath were an effort. I leaned closer, scared of missing a single syllable. What he whispered was not fear. It wasn't confusion. It was not even painful. It was resolved. They don't know about. Help me get revenge. My breath hitched. My granddad, the kindest guy I knew, was seeking vengeance. I stared at him and murmured, "Grandpa, I am here. I'm not going anywhere." But my pulse was racing because I knew something he didn't. Revenge was not going to be loud or violent. It was going to be lawful, patient, deliberate, and carried out by a Marine who had just discovered that the family she trusted had crossed a line that no one ever returns from. I did not sleep that night. The hospital lights never dimmed, and the persistent beeping of Grandpa's monitor kept me in a bizarre state of rage and resolve. Marines like myself are adept at remaining awake. We learn to stay awake in deserts, storms, and barracks packed with snoring Marines. However, nothing prepares you for the fluorescent loneliness of a hospital room where someone you care about is on the verge of dying. I sat down, elbows on my knees, peering at Grandpa's face. His cheekbones were sunken. His hands twitched occasionally. But he was still alive, more so than he should have been given what my parents had done. Around 5:30 a.m., a nurse arrived to check vital signs. She smiled sweetly at me, as elderly nurses often do with service members. "You're his granddaughter?" she inquired softly. "Yes, ma'am. He's lucky you found him. Hypothermia and older adults sets in fast. Another couple hours and..." She stopped, but the unfinished phrase drifted there anyhow. I nodded and swallowed the knot in my throat. "Thank you for everything." When she went, I reached for Grandpa's hand. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you alone again." His eyes twitched. He wasn't totally conscious, but something within him knew my voice. That was sufficient. A hospital social worker in her 50s entered about mid-morning, wearing reading glasses on a crimson lanyard and exuding a calm, steady demeanor. "Good morning," she murmured, drawing up a chair. "I'm here to talk about your grandfather's condition and how he was found." I exhaled. I expected this. She folded her hands. "You claim to have found him alone in an unheated room during the winter." "Yes." "And your parents?" "They left him in your care without informing you." I hesitated and then nodded. "They traveled on a Christmas cruise." Her eyebrows rose in silent surprise as she made no arrangements for heat or food. "They left a note." I leaned back in my chair, irritation rising again. "A note, as if it were a casual errand. Take care of Grandpa." She exhaled deeply and slowly. "This is senior neglect, and perhaps elder abandonment. In several states, this is a felony." Hearing the word felony made something inside me freeze. I wasn't thinking about retribution at the time. I was thinking about justice. Slow, meticulous, and thorough. The way Marines approach situations, not emotionally, but tactically. You identify the threat, gather intelligence, and carry out the plan. "What will happen next?" I asked. "For the time being, we are focusing on stabilizing him, but if he is awake and able to communicate, we will need to understand his living arrangements, and you may need to consider reporting the issue." I nodded. "I will." But even as I spoke, I remembered what he murmured. "They are unaware of the phrase 'help me get revenge.'" I had no idea what he meant, but I was determined to find out. That afternoon, Grandpa awoke fully for the first time. His speech was delicate, like paper rustling, but his eyes were sharper than I had seen them in years. "Keto," he muttered. I moved closer. "I'm here, Grandpa." He scanned the room slowly, uncertainty giving way to remembrance. Then, to my amazement, he giggled softly. "I bet your parents are enjoying their cruise." I clenched my mouth. "Grandpa, why didn't you call me or anyone?" He shrugged, if you can call that a shrug. "The phone line was shut off months ago. Your father claimed it was too pricey." I bit back a burst of rage, "And they left you without heat." His eyes softened, not with sadness, but with a sense of acceptance. "They don't want an older man around." I slowed them down. "Make them feel uncomfortable. This does not excuse what they did." He squeezed my hand with unexpected power. "No, it does not." A prolonged pause. Then he said, "They think they know everything. They think they've controlled everything, but they don't know about." He peered around, as if looking for eavesdroppers, then lowered his voice even further. "They don't know about the documents." I blinked. "Do?" He gave a weak nod. "Your grandmother. She left letters, wills, and deeds. I hid them. Your parents never discovered them. They believe I signed everything over. They believe I'm helpless." He let out a weak breath. That could have been a laugh. "I may be older, but I am not stupid." I leaned in. "What kinds of documents?" "The kind that alters who owns what." The kind that reveals what they took. They've been siphoning money from my pension. But they are unaware that I have kept proof. This time, my heart thumped with understanding rather than fury. This wasn't simply neglect. This was financial exploitation. What amount did they take? I asked. He closes his eyes. More than I'd like to confess. However, they would prefer that I not inform anyone. A icy shiver ran down my spine. He reopened his eyes, this time sharper. You're a Marine, strong and intelligent. You understand how to fight wars in the appropriate way. I need your help to finish this one. I gripped his hand. Where are the documents? His lips formed a determined, almost wicked smile. In the house, hidden where your father would never bother to look. I'll tell you when I'm stronger. Okay, I muttered quietly. We'll get them, and we'll make this right, he said me, his eyes filled with triumph and exhaustion. Revenge, he muttered. It doesn't have to be cruel. Sometimes it's just the truth finally catching up. I fought back tears. I understand. And I accomplished more than he realized. Before midnight, after he had fallen asleep again, I entered the hallway. The hospital was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes from equipment and distant talks at nursing stations. I leaned against the wall to let everything settle. My parents had left him to die. He had proof of what had been taken. And now he trusted me, the daughter they mocked, the Marine they hardly mentioned, to put things right. I had no idea what I would find in that house, but I knew this much. When my parents returned from their happy, sun-filled cruise, they were met with an unexpected storm. And, for once, they would not be in complete control. The next morning, I traveled back home alone. Leaving Grandpa at the hospital made my stomach turn, but the nurse looked me in the eye and said, "He's stable. He needs rest. Go handle what you need to handle." And the social worker was even more direct. If there exists documentation, securing them as soon as possible will make him safer. So I traded the blaring monitors for the peace and quiet of my parents' street, driving my ancient sedan down the same cul-de-sac I used to bike through as a child. Their house looked precisely the same: white siding, a crooked mailbox, and Grandma's small wind chime still hanging on the porch. From the outside, it didn't look like a place where you'd leave an elderly man to freeze. It just appeared natural. This was the bit that made my skin crawl. Inside, the air was still frigid, but not as bitter and homicidal as the night before. I turned up the thermostat and listened to the furnace rattle awake before standing in the living room for a moment, listening to the house settle. "Start where your grandmother prayed," Grandpa murmured. I understood what he meant. The den. Growing up, that small room off the hallway served as Grandma's shelter. My father never went in there except to seek for a pen. To him, it was simply the old room with the books. To her, it was where she read her Bible and spoke with God before the sun rose. The den smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. Her recliner was still sitting near the window, with the cushion firmly molded to her figure. A bookshelf stretched along one wall, drooping from the weight of aged Bibles, devotionals, and family photo albums. I walked right to her favorite Bible, a brown leather one with soft edges. I took it down and flipped over the pages. Halfway through Psalms, my thumb landed on something that didn't belong. An envelope. My name, Emma, was handwritten on the front in Grandma's exquisite script. You can pull the girl out of her childhood, put her in a uniform, and transport her throughout the world. But the penmanship brought me right back to sitting at her kitchen table, licking icing off beers while Mom penned birthday cards. I swallowed and then opened it. Dear Emma. It has begun. If you're reading this, it implies I didn't get to clarify things in person as I had hoped. She wrote about my parents in the kind yet tragically honest tone she possessed. She loved them, she added, but she was concerned for them. They were careless with money. They prefer to discuss what we will receive one day rather than our responsibilities. She and Grandpa had gone to see a lawyer to ensure that their wishes were followed rather than assumed. She explained that there were 2 sets of papers. The official ones are with the attorney, and there are copies in the house. If things ever feel wrong to you, call the attorney on the card enclosed. He knows our instructions. We trust you to do what's right. Tucked underneath the letter was a small index card with a legal firm name and a local phone number. I put the letter and card into the inside pocket of my uniform, directly above my heart. I've got them, Grandma, I said quietly. Then I started searching. Grandpa used to joke that his safe places were simply places my father was too lazy to look. It turned that he was not mistaken. A metal cigar tin he hadn't touched in years sat in the desk drawer beside the recliner, beneath an old deck of cards and a dried-out pen. Under a handful of foreign coins and a rusted keychain was a folded packet of documents kept together by a fragile rubber band. I opened it and began reading. The first document was a copy of the deed to the house I was standing in. The owner listed was my grandfather, not my father or mother, just him. In the margin, a crisp stamped notation indicated a life estate interest for granddaughter Emma M. Harris. My name on paper is linked to this house. The following pages had bank statements, thin paper, neat columns, and hideous patterns. Month after month of transfers from Grandpa's little account to an account in my father's name, no reimbursements with explicit notes, just cryptic online transfers that always went one way. I recalled all the times my father had sighed and told me, "You have no idea what it costs to care for your grandfather. And we're the ones carrying him." I'd felt awful on more than one deployment for not sending more money home. Looking at those statements, the remorse faded and something colder took its place. This was not sacrifice. This was siphoning. The packet contained a photocopy of a will signed by my grandparents as well as letterhead that matched the name on the index card in my pocket. It provided explicit instructions. Grandpa's care needed to be paid for first. After Dad died, I was to get the house and a portion of his savings. My parents were listed, but not as proprietors or sole beneficiaries. There were layers of protection outlined in clear terms. Tucked behind the will was one last message in my grandmother's handwriting addressed to Grandpa. "If they put pressure on you, remember Emma will do what's right." I closed my eyes and placed my hand flat on the paper. "I hear you," I replied softly. "I'll handle it." I grabbed the deed, statements, a copy of the will, and any other relevant documents I could find and carefully piled them on the desk. Then I put them in a large manila envelope, carried it out to my car, and locked them in the trunk. Years of Marine experience had taught me the need of obtaining intelligence as quickly as possible. I sat in the driver's seat, took out the index card, and gazed at the number. Then I took a breath and dialed. "Grant Law Offices." A woman responded, "This is Sophia." "Hi," I said. "My name is Staff Sergeant Emma Harris. My grandparents were Richard and Elizabeth Harris. I found some documents and a letter from my grandmother asking me to call you if things seemed wrong." There was a pause in the line. Then her tone softened. "Yes, Mr. Grant mentioned that one day we might hear from you. Can you come in this morning?" The law office was in a converted old house a few miles away, with a slightly crooked wreath on the door and creaky wood floors. It did not feel like a cold corporate skyscraper. It felt like somewhere my grandparents would have trusted. "Miss Harris," a male voice called. I turned to see a gray-haired man wearing a sweater vest standing in the doorway of a little office. "I'm Ethan Grant, and I represented your grandparents. It's nice to finally meet you." We shook hands, and I followed him inside. Diplomas covered the walls. A few family portraits sat on a shelf. Children enjoying the beach, a golden retriever in the garden. Normal life resumed. I placed the envelope on his desk and explained everything as quietly as possible. The trip, the frigid house, the letter on the counter, the ambulance, the hospital, and my grandfather's mumble concerning documents he was unaware of. He listened without interrupting, his face becoming more serious with each detail. Then he opened the envelope and began going through the documents. "Your grandmother was extremely thorough," he remarked finally. "She and your grandfather were very clear about what they wanted." He went on to say that the will on file in his office matched the document I'd presented. Grandpa was to keep control of his assets while alive, with precautions in place in case he needed additional assistance. After his death, the house and